The Vince Dixon Show. History, current events, and the rule of law.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vince Dixon Show. I'm your host, Ron Tennyson. This show presents an overview of the remarkable story of Frances Perkins, an individual who should be among the best-known Americans, yet is not. Frances Perkins' wisdom has affected all of our lives for generations. Social Security, for one example, is central to our society and was designed by Frances Perkins, along with other programs. She was the very first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor from 1933 to 1945, and as an American workers' rights advocate, fundamentally shaping the American middle class. It is common knowledge that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was associated with the New Deal. Yet, in their own time, it was known that Frances Perkins was the author and architect of the New Deal, which evolved into a social safety net that shaped and transformed our social fabric in the United States. Over the years, it has evolved. As it evolved, the New Deal was from time to time adjusted and debated. Today, however, it is under threat. This particular program is a wonderful example of the exploration of American history and civics that is the focus of the Vince Dixon Show. The show Vince and I hold a shared view that civics is the effective operating manual for government, and in our judgment, understanding civics and history has never been more important than it is to this nation today. History is the story of how those operating manuals are used, how they intersect and evolve. Public policy, on the other hand, is actually about the dynamic by which daily government actions are conducted and supervised. Understanding these distinct and intersecting aspects of legal constitutional standards is important to understanding the foundational aspects of government, and particularly how government action provides the needed information, the services to assist the general public. That process is generally known as the body politic. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and historian, Vince Dixon, who will touch on an outline of the life and many accomplishments of Frances Perkins, and we will then take a few minutes to discuss her leadership role in transforming the social fabric of the United States. Vince, good to see you again.
Thank you, Ron. And we welcome our viewers to the fifth broadcast of the continuing series of the Vince Dixon Show. The focus of our shows includes looking at biographies of significant individuals who have created particularly important public policy ideas and may well have implemented such ideas. My perspective is that of a respected historian on the purposes and evolution of government, a subject that should be on everyone's agenda. This show again looks at topics in more depth, and particularly in this show, the great American, Frances Perkins. We need a vehicle for providing insight in a historical context in that insight to understand where we are at this time in history and how we might go forward. This is my agenda. On this show, we look at the first woman to be a United States Cabinet Secretary, Frances Perkins, who should be known quite well, a daughter of Massachusetts, an inspirational social architect, and an effective public policy administrator. I am pleased to share these programs with Ron Tennyson, your co-host today, sharing the cameras and the microphones with myself. I am pleased to have had the opportunity to be well known in Winchester and beyond. It is my pleasure to share this session with Ron. And let's look at some of the details of the show that we're looking at. This is myself at a Cambridge historic event, and my background in terms of being homeschooled, Harvard University Extension School, the School of Education, and some related programs where I learned a great deal about history, economics, and other related fields. Important to recognize here three extremely important aspects of a very bountiful and engaged life. This was a woman who eventually became an American Episcopal saint, declared a little over a dozen years ago. She was the author of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his people backed her ideas because they were part of a moderately progressive approach at a time when the nation's economy was really broken down. But she was the designer that helped to rescue both the United States and much of the American economy. And it includes Social Security, one of the most important things that people tend to call the social safety net. Most every American knows of the social safety net. They should know of Frances Perkins, born in Boston, a college graduate of Mount Holyoke College, tough and caring, first woman in the United States cabinet who designed Social Security and more. This is a picture of her faculty member at Mount Holyoke College who taught political economy. Professor Anna Mae Sewell required students to visit a local factory or factories to see the conditions under which workers were working. This was really quite adventurous in educational curriculum in the late 18 and early 1900s. And among other things, she actually asked her students to read W.E. Du Bois, the first great African-American doctorate from Harvard in history. It shocked Miss Perkins what she saw in the factories and led her to a career of social advocacy, policy development, and important societal change. This was at an early point. She came from a Congregationalist family, quite common across New England. Born Fannie Coralie Perkins, changes her name slightly to Frances Perkins when she becomes confirmed later on in the Episcopal Church. Born in 1880, passed away in 1965 at a good and advanced and productive age of 85, and this is from the Perkins Papers at Mount Holyoke College. This is later on one of the most significant events in American labor history and society. Frances Perkins happened to be working nearby in a social service organization. She came out and saw much of the great tragedy. It further set her on a road to being a social architect, and Teddy Roosevelt appointed her to an early commission to look at worker rights and safety. This picture from the Cornell University collection, this building now called the Brown Building at NYU, which has been restored and is used for classrooms and offices. Truly the architect of the New Deal. When you're going to design something, you have to have an architecture, and she saw a broad range of what was needed. In many ways also an apostle of social progress, certainly influenced by some of her social and ethical feelings from her moderately religious upbringing. She said to Franklin Delano Roosevelt when she was to be appointed Secretary of Labor, there's 6 things she wanted to accomplish. She only accomplished 5 of them, but all of them important. She created Social Security, she created unemployment insurance, and those 2 particular programs came out of a commission that she chaired that looked at economic security. Remember, a society where economic security had vanished. She led to the banning of child labor, a minimum wage, established mandatory overtime pay after 40 hours. And her 6th goal she did not accomplish in her lifetime, universal health insurance, but we've gotten close to that with the various programs we developed, and interestingly enough, a recent anniversary where former Governor Romney and people part of the Ted Kennedy campaign met to celebrate a 20th anniversary of the Massachusetts healthcare system that has been copied to an extent at the national level. This is from Time Magazine. Time Magazine was an extraordinarily successful publication across the nation. And this, if you look carefully at the small print, it's very clear. Frances Perkins, author of the New Deal. U.S. Secretary of Labor the entire time of the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman had a somewhat more ambiguous relationship, and she wound up leaving as secretary, but she was then appointed to a civil service commission that still did some important service. In case you thought there was a misprint, this is a second cover of Time Magazine. She's also credited with the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which hired thousands of mostly young men to do work in the national parks, the national forests, and many other areas, and developing the idea that there ought to be fair labor standards, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this, of course, led to inspiration across a broad part of the United States, depending upon how progressive a state was. People began to address these ideas at a state level as well. The knowledge of Social Security, what was needed to do it, comes from the fact she was on the board of the Church of the Pension Fund, now called the Church Pension Group of the Episcopal Church of the United States in New York City. I first came to be a little bit aware of that particular connection because Reverend Thomas Brown, who was rector of the parish of Epiphany in Winchester, had at an early point been elected to fill a vacancy on that board. He's now actually the Bishop of Maine. And he thought people should know just a little bit about it, and I dug into it and discovered a lot more than anyone might have expected. The Church Pension Group exists to support clergy and lay employees of the Episcopal Church in their calling to spread the gospel, but especially, of course, at some point people either retire or become ill, and it allows them a degree of dignity, and that's what Social Security began as. Perhaps her most famous quote was, "I came to Washington to work for God, FDR, and the millions of forgotten, plain, common working men." The somewhat less known quote, which is equally important, "The people are what matter to government, and a government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life." This certainly encodes social service, the role of government in providing assistance to those who presumably consent to be governed by elections and appointed officials who are taking an oath of office to faithfully serve the law. This is the National Historic Landmark in Maine. It was in her family in Newcastle, Maine. This is the homestead itself. Part of this goes back to her family in the early 1700s, now in the process of becoming a major national park site. This is an icon of Frances Perkins. Her feast day is on May 13th every year. And people say, wait a second, saint? Well, Episcopal Church of the United States is a fairly high church. And she meets the test of what a saint might be. Perhaps not some people think in miracles in the direct sense, but more importantly, she was miraculous in the fact that she helped to give people the dignity and the capacity to see a life with a little bit of compensation at retirement. And that's surely miraculous because the sense of how predatory capitalism and the Gilded Age that lingered into society and the Great Depression meant that a lot of people really had lost hope or grimly hung on rather than retire. Because they knew retirement would be really a step down in life. And here there's a bridge to the next, both through unemployment insurance. If you lost your job, you'd have an opportunity to find a new one over some period of time, and an opportunity for a longer life with a little bit more respect and dignity when you, quote, retire. This is her grandson in the presentation of an icon of Frances Perkins to a church in Maine, which she attended oftentimes when she was there. Tomlin Perkins Cargasol, the grandson, actually in 2009 founded the Frances Perkins Center. President Biden, at his side in December 16 of 2024, signed the proclamation designating the family homestead the Frances Perkins National Monument, over 50 acres, including the homestead, one of the largest gifts of land and property to the national park system. Established in 2009, its goal is to preserve and uphold the legacy of Frances Perkins, the woman behind the New Deal. It is now also with a nonprofit organization that inspires current and future generations to understand and uphold the government's role in providing justice and economic security for all. This is some contact information. There is a season of visitation from, I believe, sometime in late April to sometime in late summer, early fall. It is well worth a site visiting, and some programming that's being developed around that, and they've now hired a full-time director to enhance the programming and the knowledge of this vast amount of work that she did. And it's time for our discussion about this remarkable individual and social progress.
Well, you know, she truly was remarkable, and I would say she was ahead of her time, and probably a visionary. That all of those apply to a description of her. But I want to step back to the very beginning of her education. It seems that, or at least as a collegian, her experience at, was it Mount Holyoke?
Mount Holyoke, yes, South Hadley.
Her teacher made a very large impression on her, and the mentorship she got seems to me to have led Frances to a life of concern about people and workers and worker advocate issues. which is quite remarkable. So it's a real demonstration of the importance of mentors in bringing someone's best instincts forward. And I think that is, I don't know, I've forgotten the name of her teacher. You did show it.
Anna Mae Soul.
Yeah, well, Anna Mae deserves a lot
With
of...
a soul, of sorts.
Yeah.
An interesting name.
It is. But I think she obviously provide a spark of inspiration for Frances that led to a benefit to this country, which is absolutely remarkable.
Remember that after the Civil War, large numbers of women continued to be in society after the War of Independence or the Revolution, as some people talk about in our observances of it.
Yeah.
A lot of women kind of went back into the home sphere. A few migrated into public life. That was less so after the Civil War. And in fact, the women's colleges that developed, women's programs, Wellesley College nearby, where women now were receiving much the same education and degrees. After the War of Independence, many women were tutored by the same individuals who were tutoring their sons going to Harvard, but didn't have the opportunity to earn the degrees. Now, after the Civil War, higher education grows and becomes a project in New England in many ways to draw people. If you're living in a local community, taking courses in a local building, you might also buy food in the local community, live in a local home. And in many cases in New England, schools were actually kind of local businesses, which eventually developed into the great higher education industry with social values that were deeply rooted in the Congregational religion originally, and more so in the Unitarian religion, which became kind of the conscience of the abolitionists after some struggle on those issues somewhat earlier.
Vince, as a historian, I have another question about her that I think is germane to our current times. You know, when I look at her credentials, she obviously was concerned about people, concerned about Social Security, the Fair Labor Standards Act, workplace safety. Those sound like the credentials of someone who would have made a very good president. But did she ever entertain the idea do you know from a historical point of view, did she ever entertain
remember,
the idea?
women's suffrage only had come along recently, so the idea that all women would vote if they're qualified otherwise was still kind of new. The fact that she was the first person who was a woman in the cabinet was adventurous. At an earlier point in a New York commission, a man said after about 6 months, who had been skeptical of the woman who he was working with, said after 6 months, maybe the effectiveness and capability she's demonstrated, there ought to be more women in government. But the United States has been kind of slow along the way, and some people think that there's a religious element. We can examine when we do currents of faith at a later point. But in the Catholic tradition, with all of its strengths and weaknesses, there are male and female saints. And a Protestant friend of mine some years ago said that was important and thought that's why in Europe there were more female leaders. In the United States, saints were tending to be not paid much attention to the lower church culture. And here's an example of a higher church culture with liturgy. And one of the other things, which this is kind of an overview, we'll do more about it, but it turns out that on weekends sometimes she would go up to a monastery in Maryland and pray. Think for a moment that social commitment by a top federal official to go and pray about their life and what they might accomplish, you know, in a secularized version of what would Jesus do that some people talk about. This is not about having a particular religion, but it's a social ethos, an ethic that is drawn from that sense of Jewish and Christian tradition, that it's not just about saving yourself, it's not just about treating other people well, but what you might accomplish to help other people to actually improve their lives and have better individual experiences. And that's an important part of how the United States has made progress, and she was clearly an apostle of that. Not surprising that people should say this is a saintly quality.
Just to follow on the thought that I was working with a moment ago, there have been women who've run for president, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, for example. But when I look at the credentials that Frances Perkins had, someone who had developed legislation, who had cared about workers, who cared about the public. Not many men or women who've run for president have those kinds of credentials in a modern sense. I can't think of a candidate who could claim the kind of record of performance and public concern that she has demonstrated. So if she were here today, what would you say? Would she make a good presidential candidate? She, a woman.
You know, we've had a variety of women political leaders over the last 40, 50 years who have contributed each in their own way. But one of the very first to actually run for president was Shirley Chisholm from New York.
Yeah.
And people said, wait a second, a woman, a black woman running for president, what's that about?
Yeah.
And nevertheless, she made contributions. And part of being in the public arena, and I know that without going into too much detail, is that people say, what are you doing that for?
Yeah.
Because the people who make progress are those who think about what needs to be done, not so much about themselves.
Yeah.
And though FDR was an ambitious individual, he was part of a higher church culture. It turns out he was Episcopalian himself. And there's been much debate about what Episcopalian views have. But there is an interesting intersection. John Henry Newman, who we will talk about at some later point, who was recently declared a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, actually transformed the Church of England, the Anglican Episcopal tradition, and the Catholic tradition that he later joined, by emphasizing prayer, music, liturgy, and a broader culture of religion that literally transacts into civilian and secular culture, not as religion, but a secularized version of service and respect that we are all equal in God's eyes.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately how we, if we are made in the image and likeness of God, have the opportunity to be responsible as we would want our fellow citizens to be, or our fellow residents, as the case may be, in the international world that many people have struggled with since World War II. What does it mean to be a good person in your nation, and what does it mean to have an international community with culture and shared economy?
Yeah. Just on this particular subject, I have this hope that I will at some point have the opportunity to greet Madam President of the United States. That's a dream I've had for a long time, and I'm looking forward to that day. Just one moment there is notice that when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House, they were among the very first women to be in the line of succession to be president in the event of emergency, and that was notable by itself. And the power they exercise, Secretary of State of the United States, is more than just foreign policy. It actually has traditional English government roles. So, for instance, when President Nixon resigned, he resigned to the Secretary of State of the United States, who happens to have actually been born in Germany, a few generations before. So there's a lot of different intersections. We should perhaps do more, depending upon the capacities of people, but we've made some progress, and the important part is to think about what we as individuals can bring to making progress, not just say, oh, this is terrible, somebody should do something. Yes, somebody should be you or I or the people watching the show. I guess I'm thinking my four granddaughters. I don't know that any one of them would be a president, but it's just like for their benefit to be able to say that there has been or will be a president of the United States who's female. Let me turn for a minute to the Triangle Fire. That had a big impact on Frances Perkins, not only her life, but her thoughts and the process that followed. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Triangle Fire? What caused it? What was the upshot of it all?
Well, today we would talk about it as an OSHA situation, occupational safety and health. It was a place where shirts and clothes were manufactured, and there were cloth fabrics and pieces around. They weren't necessarily being organized as well. The exits themselves in many cases were locked or blocked so that, quote, people wouldn't take stuff out and steal it or wouldn't go out in the hallway to smoke. It was not being policed very well. The owners themselves were a bit negligent, to be sure, and were themselves of potentially lower class or working class background who were ambitious and entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
But it reflected the fact that people, you were heading towards the Gilded Age, or already were there, where great pools of wealth were being assembled and not distributed. And there's many arguments about social policy and what income profile should be, but those issues arise again and again. They arose in the late 1800s, they arose in the 1920s, they arose in the debate about the federal income tax, which was actually unconstitutional, and they had to get a constitutional amendment. Local issues in the states and local cities and towns even. What is a livable wage as opposed to a minimum wage? Are they the same thing?
Yeah.
The same issues occur and reoccur, and if we go back and realize that these issues have been there, and something like the fire really caught people's attention, not only was this horrible, but the death toll and how many other situations. And there was actually a lesser known fire in New York that she actually investigated as well that killed about 80 people that we can talk about in another show. There's a lot of individual events. This is kind of for the working environment of working people, not like unlike a 9/11 type event. It so caught people's attention. The tragedy was so massive that people had to pay attention and say, wait a second, we need to prevent these things from happening. And then the combination of social change. And by the way, Tammany Hall and some other people got involved because they said it would be nice to look like they were helping people, which was part of their claim to actually
The
be
image, huh?
a corrupt system.
Yeah.
And sometimes corrupt systems help and in ironic ways.
Yeah.
But this, as long as we have an open society and we're able to talk to people about this and reach back and look at history and civics, that is important. So thank you very much for sharing this and this continued exploration of our history. Other shows, we've already looked at some of this, of exploring the purposes of government, its evolution, the importance of Evacuation Day, and this, which is civics, civic literacy, and civic learning. The show is about Frances Perkins, and this is kind of an overview, and we will look at more about her in the future. The history of industrial revolutions that you and I have talked about, artificial intelligence that is transforming world civilization, Rerum Novarum, which addresses industrial revolutions, Mass 250, which has ended, and the United States 250 upcoming, the War Powers Act, continuing debates about what role Congress has in terms of that. And in fact, it's not just been used occasionally. In the life of it, which is now several decades, there have been at least 186 instances where the War Powers Act has been touched on through some legal action. We'll talk about that in the late summer, early fall, a mini-series on the United States Constitution, the development of constitutional standards, constitutional amendments, and constitutional reform possibilities, and ultimately educating for transformational change. Thank you for watching and listening, and thank you, Ron.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Until we see you next time, have a good day. Take care.